watching Shalom TV, celebrating Jewish culture. Funding for Shalom TV has been provided by the following. And by viewers like you.
I'm J.J. Goldberg. I'm the editor-at-large of The Forward. We're with Alon Pinkas, who is a former Israeli diplomat. He was the Consul General of Israel in New York. He was a longtime journalist, and he's currently an international strategic consultant based in Tel Aviv. And Alon is here with Shlomo Gazit and 5 other people, former ambassadors and former generals, to spread a message in the United States for several days from Israel. What do you see as the goal of your visit here?
Enrichment more than anything. I mean, there is a sense that the status quo is okay. On the other hand, when people say the status quo is unsustainable, they don't care to elaborate what exactly they mean by that. And I think our goal here is to try and talk to the American media. We had meetings in Congress, some meetings with the administration officials, not to ask specifically for the U.S. to do anything and not to in any way criticize the Israeli government, but just to say that there is an urgency to relaunch a peace process, even though it seems difficult and complex. The stakes are high, given what may happen.
But the message that you're bringing is the 67 borders are defensible?
Well, look, this is a heterogeneous delegation. It is made up of 5 former generals. Part of that message is that the idea that the 1967 borders are indefensible is debatable. The current borders are indefensible.
Why are the current borders indefensible?
Because the threats have changed. The threats are no longer huge armored formations storming in from Iraq and Syria and Jordan, or for that matter from Egypt, but rather weapons of mass destruction, terrorism, long-range missiles, medium-range missiles, and short-range rockets. That is not to say that Israel should move back to the 1967 line with or without land swaps overnight and assume that everything's going to be okay. There is a security dimension here. No one is talking about the 1967 lines, but we're talking about the 67 line on a demographic basis, given the different threats, in the context of a peace agreement.
Now again, you said this border is not defensible. What makes the current border less defensible than some other negotiated border?
Scattered settlements that are indefensible, but essentially and most importantly, the demographic empretzelment of Jews and Arabs in that area, which would enable the Palestinian Arabs to become a majority between the River Jordan and the Mediterranean within 5, 10, or 15 years. Now, I know there are several demographic studies, as you said before, that suggest otherwise, but the conventional wisdom amongst demographers, given birth rates, given current populations, any way you count them, shows right now a 52 to 48 Jewish majority. If these two communities are not disassociated, and I'm less of a peacenik than a lot of members in this delegation, but if these two communities are not separated, the next logical and, in my mind, tragic phase may be that the Palestinians will say, fine by us, one man, one vote. That is something I'd like to avoid. Can that be done quickly? No. Can that be done easily? No. Is it risk-free? Absolutely not. Should it be done? Yes.
Now, any negotiation assumes that the Palestinians will have a contiguous state.
Yes.
There are 2 major Israeli urban areas, Ariel and Ma'ale Adumim, that cut the Palestinian state in half. What are you going to do with them?
Well, Ariel is part of the 3 blocks that will probably most likely be incorporated into Israel in any arrangement. That's been discussed at Camp David in July of 2000. That has been recognized by the U.S. during the George Bush administration. And that is something that even Prime Minister Olmert and Foreign Minister Livni negotiated with the Palestinians to no avail, but nonetheless, it's on the table. As for Ma'ale Adumim, there's no way Ma'ale Adumim is going to be dismantled, and there's no way that Ma'ale Adumim will continue to exist within a sovereign Palestinian state. There are a lot of creative solutions on how to incorporate Ma'ale Adumim. It is not easy. It is not easy technically. It is not easy demographically, and it's certainly not easy politically, but it can be done. If that is the one issue that remains to be dealt with or solved, we're in good shape. As you know, that is not the first issue.
Well, what is the first issue?
The first issue is launching a process. The first issue is recognizing that there need to be two states. First issue is the same issue. The first issue is essentially delineating not a final, but a general idea of where the border is going to be. Everything else will be dealt with later. Dealing with Jerusalem and the refugee issues right now is a non-starter. The Palestinian positions and Israeli positions cannot be reconciled at this point.
Is there any chance that the Palestinians will give up the demand to bring their diaspora back into Israel proper?
That's their issue, not mine. As far as I'm concerned, that won't happen, that can't happen, and that if that is a precondition or a prerequisite, then they'll never have a state. They should make up their minds. It's been a long time since they've been offered a state, 1937, not to mention 47, and again, if they wish to abuse this other opportunity that they're being given, not being given, but hopefully will be given, it's their business. It affects us as well. And I do not look forward to saying I was right, they were wrong, status quo wins. That's bad. That is very bad. They should make up their mind. Do they want to be right from their point of view and demand historical justice and never have a state? Or do they want to have a state with less than full historical justice, as we did in 1948?
And you have any reason to believe that they will?
I don't know. Truthfully, I do not know.
I'm sitting here with Shlomo Gazit, who is visiting from Israel. He is president of the Center for Defense Studies and a former chief of military intelligence, former coordinator of government operations in the territories, and a former president of Ben Gurion University. He's come here sponsored by J Street.
Right.
And can you tell me what is the goal of your visit?
I believe that we in Israel, we the Middle East, we are facing now a very critical moment. We are facing now a motion, probably in September, of a UN resolution recognizing the existence of an independent new Palestinian state based on the 1967 borders with East Jerusalem as its capital. And literally, we seem to be not prepared for that motion, not really understanding the consequences of this motion and what could be done between now and September, what should be done between now and September in order to more or less circumvent that motion or the dangers of that motion.
Well, what are the dangers of the motion?
I would say, I would begin by saying what we should not be worried about. This motion, as long as it will not be brought to the Security Council, this motion will not establish an independent Palestinian state. It will be only a statement, it will be a declaration and nothing beyond it.
And that's because the General Assembly has no enforcement power.
Exactly. However, we probably will be seeing, if this motion goes through, of course, developments in three different spheres. One, international, we shall see 50, 60, 70 Palestinian embassies established all over the world, recognizing this Palestinian state in being. This is a political move, important from a public relations point of view, but nothing beyond. The second is already a major threat in the territories itself. For Palestinians living in the West Bank, in Judea and Samaria, such a declaration may create demonstrations according to the new philosophy, non-violent demonstrations in the footsteps of Mahatma Gandhi, in the footsteps of Luther King. But these non-violent demonstrations might easily become violent when they will try storming, I don't know, an Israeli settlement in the West Bank, trying to move into Jewish quarters in East Jerusalem and things like that. And if it becomes violent, and if there are casualties, maybe even unfortunately heavy casualties, we'll see the beginning of the third intifada. And this will lead, or may lead, back to an international reaction towards, I would say, what I call the delegitimation of Israel in public opinion all over the world. So it might be a totally new situation, a very dangerous one from an Israeli point of view, and it's still not too late. We are roughly 2 months before the motion to try and to circumvent it, to try and to come up with a counter motion which is more responsible, more balanced at the UN, or to start immediately direct negotiations between the Israeli leadership and the Palestinian leadership, so that there will be no need to come up with that motion at the UN. This, in a nutshell, is what we are trying to say, to tell public opinion today.
My understanding is that the Palestinian leadership has refused to enter negotiations.
On the contrary, the statement made by Mahmoud Abbas is very clear. If we start negotiations, there will be no motion at the UN. There will be no...
But Prime Minister Netanyahu has said repeatedly that he's willing to negotiate.
Yes, but he has his conditions.
He has conditions.
And his condition is they have first to recognize Israel as a Jewish state.
And what's wrong with that?
There is nothing wrong with that, only I think there is no chance that Palestinians will accept it.
And the Palestinians have a condition that there first must be a complete halt to settlement construction, no?
No, not anymore.
They withdrew that.
They don't make an issue of it just at this present moment.
And why would the Palestinians not recognize Israel as a Jewish state?
You see, I have nothing against it, of course. But if I try to understand the Palestinian philosophy, the Palestinians have not given up their dream that the whole of Palestine should be Arab, should be Palestinian. Such a declaration means we should give up our dream.
Well, isn't the assumption of a two-state solution that both sides give up their dreams?
No, both sides accept reality. They don't give up dreams. If we accept some sort of a compromise border, that doesn't mean that we Jews will not dream about the whole of Eretz Israel being Jewish. But we have to accept reality and say, under the present circumstances, this is the best we can agree upon. And the same goes for the Palestinians. I would go even one step further. you would hardly find a Palestinian or an Arab who would say, I believe that Israel has a right to exist as a Jewish state in the middle of my Arab Muslim Middle East. None would say it. Everybody would say you would be glad to wake up tomorrow morning and see Israel disappear. However, we have to face reality. And reality is that Israel is strong, Israel is viable, and there is nothing we Arabs can do to destroy Israel, to make it disappear. At the very same time, you have us Israelis. My sentiment goes for Nablus and for Hebron as much as, perhaps even more ideologically, than it goes for Tel Aviv, Haifa, and this little city I'm living now in Kfar Saba. But I have to face reality. There is an strong Arab population living there, and if we don't separate, in no time, we Jews in the land of Israel will become a minority. Today we are 52% to 48% Arabs. In 10 years' time, the figures will be reversed. We'll be the 45%, and they will be the 55%.
I've seen figures that suggest that the demographic so-called threat is not so great now that Israel no longer holds Gaza.
If you call it, Israel doesn't hold Gaza, because Gaza is part of Palestine. They haven't, no Arab, no Palestinian has accepted a separation between the Gaza Strip and the West Bank. For them, both are part of Palestine. So
now, the withdrawal, I assume, would begin, the Palestinians say that withdrawal has to be based on the 67 borders.
this should be the starting line for negotiations, and they agree on a swap.
The assumption is that those borders are indefensible.
Yes and no. As a military man, I don't know any borders, any Israeli borders that can be defensible. The size of Israel, surrounded with an Arab Muslim Middle East, there are no defensible borders from a military point of view. The point, however, is, and if I go back to Abba Evan with his poor definition, calling the 67 lines as the Auschwitz lines, are that the kind of threat Israel was facing 40-something years ago, in 1967, is totally different from the kind of threat we are facing today. In 67, our main worry was an all-out Arab trust, military trust, 15, 20 armor, infantry, mechanized divisions trying to storm the borders and to destroy Israel. This is not anymore the case. We have a peace treaty with Egypt, we have our treaty with Jordan, there is no Iraq for the time being, Syria is in a chaos, so the direct military threat doesn't exist. We are facing three kinds of immediate military threats that the borders have no significance for. We are facing the threat of terrorism, and borders mean nothing when it comes to terrorism. We are facing the threat of missiles and rockets that may come from immediately across the line, be it from Gaza, the West Bank, Lebanon, or Syria, or be it from far away. We saw it in 1991 from Iraq, we may see it tomorrow from Iran, and be it in possibly, or unfortunately in a few years' time, an Iranian nuclear device. None of these threats have any significance when it comes to the borders, to the so-called Auschwitz borders of 1967. Our main concern today is not the military threat. My main concern today is Israel's existence as a Jewish state and Israel succeeding to preserve itself as a democratic state within the borders of the land of Israel, between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean. This is impossible.
Why are you saying this in America?
Well, I'm saying it in Israel. And I have a weekly column in Israel. I write about it almost every week. And I'm speaking up in Israel.
You're here with a delegation of, I believe, a number of former ambassadors and former generals.
We are 7 on a
Yeah.
delegation. We came over for literally 5 days. To the
Why? What
We
do you
were
think you're going to
invited.
get from America?
Well, first, because we were invited. But second, as I said, we have a deadline. The deadline is the end of September this year. Decisions will not be made in Jerusalem, will be made at the UN, will be made by the US at the UN, and public opinion in this country is extremely important when it comes to these decisions. So we come to deliver the message, and by the day after tomorrow, I'll be back home.
Why, if the majority of public opinion in Israel seems to be that Israel cannot leave the West Bank?
That's not true. All public opinion polls in Israel tell you that about 2/3, 60-something, 70% of the Israeli Jewish population, the Arabs, of course, when it comes to the Israeli Arabs, it's 100%. But the Israeli Jews, about 65, 70%, accept the idea of a two-state solution. And unfortunately, and the Prime Minister of Israel, Benjamin Netanyahu, in his Bar Ilan speech, he openly declared that his solution is a two-state solution. He went further when he said, I understand that there will be a need for painful decisions, namely the need of removing a major part or a certain part of Israeli settlements from the West Bank. Public opinion is not in Israel, is not bothering itself with where exactly will be the future lines separating the two states. The basis is the 67 line, and negotiated will be a swap that we, at the best, in our negotiation, spoke about something like 6 to 7% of the West Bank included inside Israel. The Palestinians in the counteroffer to Ehud Olmert spoke of something like 2.5%. And this has to be negotiated. Obviously, we would like to see the smallest number of Israeli settlers to be evacuated. It will be a very painful decision, no doubt.
So far, Israel has agreed to evacuate some various outposts and hasn't been able to do that. How can you evacuate 60 or 70,000 settlers?
If you want to evacuate 60 or 70,000 settlers, and it is not part of a political agreement, you can't do it. And this is the problem when you are referring to these outposts. As long as there is no political settlement, what's the sense of evacuating anyone? If, however, you reached an agreement, if, however, this agreement will be brought to public opinion, to a vote in the Knesset or to the people, and the people of Israel will support this settlement, then the evacuation will be very, very different. it will be a totally different problem.
Do you have reason to believe that that the Palestinians will accept a permanent peace?
The question is, what do you call a permanent peace? There is a saying that the ideal agreement is the biggest enemy of a good agreement. If we want to reach the perfect settlement and agreement between Israel and the Palestinian and the rest of the Arab world, let me warn you, it's a non-starter. The differences are such that you cannot negotiate and you cannot reach an agreement, and there will be elements that will have to be left for history to deal with and to resolve. We have a good chance of reaching, I would say, quite a good political agreement, not a perfect. There will be less, some issues will be left open, some issues we Israelis will be unhappy about, and on the other hand, Palestinians will be unhappy about. And that's the kind of the discussions, the negotiations that will have to take place. If we can't reach on a minimum acceptable terms of agreement between the two parties, then there will be no agreement. It has to be accepted, negotiated and accepted. I hope, and with the experience we had, when we look at the results of the negotiations that did take place between Ehud Olmert and Mahmoud Abbas only 2 years ago, I believe there is a good chance of reaching an agreement.
Didn't Abbas walk away from those discussions?
No, he did not walk away. They broke down literally when Abbas promised to come back with an answer, and Ehud Olmert unfortunately had to resign.
But there have been negotiations repeatedly in which the Palestinians, Arafat walked out in 2000.
Again, it is not that simple. Yes, Arafat did not accept the terms offered by Ehud Barak, but the point was Arafat didn't want to come to Camp David. Arafat at the time, his claim was, I have the Oslo Agreement. According to the Oslo Agreement, you Israelis have not yet completed your obligations of the so-called FRDs, the further redeployments, and I don't want to negotiate the final agreement, the terms of the final agreement, as long as I have not received what you have agreed to give me according to the Oslo Agreement. So it was more not a misunderstanding, two parties with a totally different attitude and goal at Camp David in 2000.